Hamataki nape, chuzapi, chante washte. Thank you all. Thank you, Leslie and Omar Berrada, who's not here tonight. They have been wonderful hosts so far. I just got back from South Dakota, and it's really cold there, and it feels balmy here. And it was also interesting to hear that there was a rupture in a pipe here, speaking of pipelines. But also, I also want to just acknowledge that this is Lenape land that we are on right now, and also want to acknowledge the indigenous water protectors here in the room, the people who are caretakers of this land who are not in this room, or who may be in this room, I don't know. But I just want to give a shout out to that, and anyone who is working on these issues. I'm happy to be here tonight. It's really an honor. And I was actually in South Dakota getting ready, not just for this lecture to talk about the past resistance of the Dakota Access Pipeline, but the present resistance against the Keystone XL pipeline. And I want to talk a little bit at the end, if there's anybody who's interested in getting involved in that. There's actually an event coming up here in New York City. But without further ado, I'll just jump right in. I'm going to shamelessly plug my book. It actually comes out March 5th. It'll be available then. You can pre-order it on Amazon, or which I don't recommend doing. We should nationalize Amazon, but that's a whole nother question. But if you can, there will be local bookstores here, like Community Books, who will be carrying it. I'll also be doing a talk next week at Community Books as well. So if you want to join me. And before I kind of get in, I just want to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book. And it's not a typical academic book, I'll be honest. Hopefully it gets me tenure. I don't know if it will. But also I just want to apologize for the slides. I know there's like a lot of designers and artists in the room. This is like an art school, and I'm not an artist, so bear with me. But the reason why I wrote this was really to make an intervention, not just in the movement itself, but in common discourse around Indigenous people. As our history is always seen as something that's in the past tense, something that happened in the 19th century. And really what I tried to do in this book is foreground our history of resistance going back 200 years, at least 2 centuries. And not that we were just some kind of like local culture, that kind of stayed home and never really, got out into the world. In the book, and I'll talk a little bit about those connections in tonight's talk, but in the book I really focus on internationalism of Indigenous peoples, not just my own peoples, but other nations in this hemisphere. And really it was solidarity. Lakota means ally, right? It's like the loosest English translation of the word. It means ally. And so that's one of our primary strengths as Indigenous, or as Lakota people, as people of the Oceti-Sakowin, the nation of the 7 council fires. And so I don't know I can't really see, but if people want to raise their hand if you actually went to the Standing Rock protest or perhaps attended an event here in New York City. Did anybody? Got like 2 people who are willing to admit. It's probably like the only Indigenous people in the room. But it drew together thousands, if not millions of people. And it wasn't just a one-time event. It was a moment within a larger movement in history. It wasn't just and it was also a movement within a moment, and I'll get into what I mean by that. So I just want to start with a scene that I set in the middle of the book. In the aftermath of the October 27th, 2016 raid on the 1851 treaty camp blockading the Dakota Access Pipeline, a rancid smell permeated the camps. Police and private security had heaped the camp's remnants, ceremonial items such as eagle feathers, pipes, medicine bundles, and staves, along with mangled tents, sleeping bags, clothing, and teepees, into a large pile near the entrance of Oceti-Sakowin camp. Cops and private security had urinated on the items before returning them. One night, after it was decided to ceremonially burn the urine-soaked remnants, an Ihanktuwa elder gathered young water protectors around a fire, and she's actually pictured here. She was dressed in the regalia she wore the day of the raid. Hundreds of copper pennies hung by red ribbons from her dark blue tradecloth dress. She told of her ancestors who were killed during the 1862 U.S. Dakota War. Evicted from their homelands, they fled to present-day Standing Rock, crossing the Missouri River not far from the location of Oceti-Shawkoe Camp, after U.S. cavalrymen massacred Dakotas and Lakotas in the Whitestone Hill Buffalo Hunt Camp. This was, to the day, exactly 150 years before Dakota Access Private Security unleashed attack dogs on unarmed water protectors at a nearby pipeline construction site. The day after Christmas in 1862, soldiers gathered up 38 Dakota men and boys and imprisoned them at Fort Snelling in Mankato, Minnesota, a place we call Makato, which means blue earth. Their medicine bundles were confiscated, heaped in a large pile, and burned as they were led to the gallows, singing their death songs. Their crime, defending their nation and homelands. The same week that President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he also signed the death sentences of 38 Dakota patriots. The copper pennies hanging from the elders' regalia had holes drilled into Lincoln's ears with red ribbons threaded through. He didn't listen, she said, of the great emancipator, so we opened his ears. After the 1876 Battle of Greasy Grass, Lakota women used awls to carve holes in Custer's ears so he would hear better in the afterlife. Now it was President Barack Obama, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple, and Morton County Sheriff Kyle Kirchmeier who refused to listen. As singers began a prayer song, the elder reminded the younger ones that the tears flowing from their eyes were their ancestors speaking through them, and that they were not tears of trauma, but of liberation. We survived genocide after genocide, she said. Then she danced, and the penny swayed with the flickering fire and billowing smoke. Behind her, armed police were perched on a hill half a mile away, and their bright floodlights glared down on us. Our history is the future. So this is a picture of what it was like at one point after the raids. The most famous raid is called the Battle of Backwater Bridge in some circles. But at nighttime, there was these floodwaters, or these floodlights blaring down on us, and it almost was like, it was kind of eerie. This is kind of like Close Encounters of the Colonial Kind. But it was also very surreal because in the camps themselves, there was a lot of kind of trauma and violence that were inflicted upon water protectors. But by and large, as I try to show in this book, even with that intense amount of state repression, whether it was attack dogs, whether it was just the everyday policing of Native people who may or may not have been at the camps by local citizens, white citizens in Bismarck, North Dakota, or in surrounding white-dominated border towns around the reservation, the feeling in the camp was very much one of freedom, right? That one elder, Faith Spotted Eagle, had said that we are living how we are supposed to live. Not just in teepees, right? Everybody, like, it's the iconic image of indigenous peoples, but as free people, according to our own destiny and our own free will. And I think of the ways in which our own history as Lakota people has been told, especially by this nation, right, the United States, which describes our people as a terminal people and our history as a terminal history, often beginning somewhere in the early 1800s and often ending in 1890 at the Wounded Knee Massacre. And also beginning and ending with the ghost dance as well. And I want to talk about the ghost dance and the notion of prophecy within our own traditions, which is often derided as something that's mythical or perhaps not on par with what would be considered Western theories of justice or Western theories of revolution. But I would make the argument that prophecy, whether it was the Black Snake prophecy or the ghost dance prophecy, were actually revolutionary theory. So the beauty and the power of the ghost dance moved Oglala prophet Nicholas Black Elk, who saw it as parallel to his own vision that the people must unite to nourish back to health the tree of life so that it can bloom once again. The dance brought Black Elk new visions of Wanikia, the Lakota word for the red Messiah that literally means to make live. In 1932, poet John Neidhart published a literary interpretation of Black Elk's vision in Black Elk Speaks, an influential book that Standing Rock scholar Vine Deloria Jr. described as the North American Bible of all tribes. After the 7th Cavalry Regiment massacred more than 300 Lakota ghost dancers at Wounded Knee in 1890, the ghost dance in Black Elk's vision were thought to be dead or dying, like Native people. Neidhart contributed to this notion by fabricating the most quoted lines in Black Elk Speaks. A people's dream died there, mourned Black Elk in this made-up version, seeing the carnage at Wounded Knee and his relatives' bodies strewn across the bloody snow. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered, he also allegedly said. And those are words that are often republished. There's a new book out that actually republishes those words as if Black Elk himself had said it. And to this day, I see documentaries still that quote those words. But Black Elk never believed that, and nor did he ever say it. And he knew the collective visions for liberation didn't die at Wounded Knee. The tree that was to bloom just faded away, he said, reflecting on the massacre 40 years later. But the roots will stay alive, and we are here to make that tree bloom. And this picture right here is a picture of what was once called Harney Peak, which was named after a U.S. cavalryman, whom we called Woman Killer, because he earned that name by killing a lot of our women. And it was our most sacred site. It was where people would go up, like Black Elk, and have visions. And today it has been renamed Black Elk's Peak, but in our language it's called Hiankaga Paha. This is a picture from our annual pilgrimage that we make every year to this particular place. And a friend of mine who is a photographer and artist named Yadika Fields took this photograph, and I thought it was really fitting because what does this picture remind you of? It reminds you of one of those old tintype photos of possibly Wounded Knee, right? But in this picture, it's the picture of the Veterans March, which happened in early December during the middle of a snowstorm. And it wasn't a picture about death, right? It was a fulfillment of that ghost dance prophecy that Black Elk had envisioned, in the late 19th century. And it brought together aspects of not just indigenous life, but non-indigenous life as well. So roots are an apt metaphor to explain how the aspirations for freedom, the tree of life, had stayed alive. Ceremonies, dance, language, warrior and political societies, and spiritual knowledge were forced underground, each of them made illegal by the punitive civilization regulations, and only fully legalized, quote unquote, in 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And like many, to protect himself and his family, Black Elk had converted to Catholicism, but he never lost faith in his vision. For him, liberation wasn't a one-off event, a single action, or a moment. If history books do not altogether deny the Wounded Knee massacre, sympathetic treatments tend to label the ghost dance as a harmless trend that would have faded into the past, like the Indians practicing it. But if it were just dancing, that was the threat. And if it were just praying, that was the threat. Then why did the United States deploy nearly half its standing army against starving, horseless, and unarmed people in order to crush it? So indigenous resistance, I contend, draws from a long history, projecting itself backward and forward in time. And while traditional historians merely interpret the past, radical indigenous historians and knowledge keepers aim to change the colonial present and to imagine a decolonial future by reconstructing or reconnecting to indigenous places and histories. And for this to occur, those suppressed practices must make a crack in history. Karl Marx once explained the nature of revolutions through the figure of the mole which burrows through history, making elaborate tunnels and preparing to surface again. The most dramatic moments come when the mole breaks the surface, revolution. But revolution is a mere moment within the longer movement of history. The mole is easily defeated on the surface by counter-revolutionary forces if she hasn't adequately prepared her subterranean spaces, which provide shelter and safety. Even when pushed back underground, the mole doesn't stop her work. In song and ceremony, Lakotas revere the mole for her hard work collecting medicines from the roots underfoot. And during his campaign against US military invasion to protect himself, Crazy Horse collected fresh dirt from mole mounds. And because he knew it to contain medicines, he washed his body with dirt. Hidden from view to outsiders, this constant tunneling, plotting, planning, harvesting, remembering, and conspiring for freedom, the collective faith that another world is possible, is the most important aspect of revolutionary work. It is from the everyday life that the collective confidence to change reality grows, giving rise to extraordinary events. And so just to give you an idea of the geography of this region, where I come from and where I was born and raised, this is a treaty map. It's really detailed, and you're not going to take much away from it. But it kind of gives you an idea of our original territory. That big white space in the center of the map is the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty territory. It's about 70 million acres, or about the size of Nevada, the state of Nevada, including the hunting territory. And the reason why this is important, because in another map I'll show later, you'll notice, you can see the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is cutting at the top and all the way down. It cuts through our hunting territory, but all the pipelines that have been built in this region have ironically avoided that western half of South Dakota, which is still considered the Great Sioux Reservation. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means to make treaties, because the interpretation that the United States has of, say, something like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty is one in which, territory, resources can all be abstracted into numbers and acreage, and that's the definition, the legal contract, sort of like a real estate transaction, as Vine Deloria has described it in the past. But this is the first pictograph of what we have as winter counts. It's our written, quote unquote, written history, right? And this is the first pictograph in Brown Hat's winter count, which shows the Te Skawi, who is the white buffalo calf woman who brought us into relations with the non-human world. And as you can see in the center of this camp circle, there's a white buffalo. And from her udders, you can't really, I don't know if you can see it from that far away, but from her udders are falling corn kernels into water. And above her, there's a yucca plant and a corn stalk. And to the right, he lists all the nations, the animal nations that were brought into relation with Lakota people, right? Te Skawi was our first and most important prophet. She brought us, it was a woman, right, who brought us the pipe and made our first treaty, our first compact with the human and non-human world. And so it was the treaty that we signed with the United States government that we remembered. And Red Cloud, who was one of our war chiefs at the time, he remembered those original treaty negotiations. And when he was talking with the generals, they put in a provision. It was Article 11. It said, so long as you shall have rights to this hunting territory, which is 32 million acres, so long as the buffaloes shall roam to justify the chase. And the generals wanted that struck from the treaty. But the Indian agents assured them, they said, well, why don't you just go kill the buffalo to get that territory? And so the killing of the buffalo translated into the acquisition of acres of territory. And even most army or cavalry regiments that were sent out to the plains never actually fought indigenous people. But their military engagements were to kill buffalo. And they even called them Indian Wars, or they even called the buffalo Redskins in some of their journal entries and the advertisements they made to wealthy European aristocrats or wealthy industrialists in the north to come out and kill buffalo. They invited them to come out on quote unquote war parties. And so our understanding, right, and Red Cloud's interpretation was that, the Lakota people are the Pteoyate, the Buffalo Nation. And our land, our territory isn't defined by these, these kind of arbitrary lines on a map, but they're defined they're defined according to our relation to buffalo, right? And their migration and their movement. And then also, according to this pictograph, our relationship is also defined by water, right? The white buffalo calf is literally like connecting with the water. Out of her udders falls corn kernels. And the reason why I'm bringing up this particular thing is because oftentimes when we think of Lakota people specifically, I had a really racist Lyft driver that picked me up today, and he was talking. He's like, "I love the Indians." He sounded like Trump. It was weird. And he was like, I used to ride a horse and dress up like an Indian. I used to put the war bonnet on. I was like, oh man, just be quiet. I'm tired. But there's the representation of Lakota people or Sioux people as they're known to the United States government is one in which it's a masculine identity, right? It's hypermasculinity. And what was really fascinating about some of the research that I've conducted is that, you look at all the portraits of Lakota people and they're all men. They have the iconic imagery of the stoic native man, right? But indigenous women are central to this story, and it was the usurpation of indigenous women's political authority, specifically Lakota and Dakota women's political authority, that led to our colonization, right? And in this book and in other places and in a presentation that I'll be giving to the class later on, if we think about, how many of you have heard the word man camp before? The man camps are the transient camps of oil workers, right? That go from one sort of construction site to the next. They'll go to the site of extraction. They're usually temporary, right? So in the movie The Revenant, with Leonardo DiCaprio, our Lord and Savior, it was actually based on a real historical figure named Hugh Glass, who was a poacher, who was trespassing through Lakota territory, who was trespassing through Mandan and Arikara territory, right? They don't really show that. They show him as kind of a Dunbar character, dances with bears. He dances with a bear instead of a wolf, but doesn't really work out for him in the end. But so he's crawling to this. He crawls across our territory after getting mauled by a bear, and he arrives at the end to a trade fort, which is actually called Fort Kiowa, which became the town that I was born and raised in, called Chamberlain, South Dakota, which is a notorious border town, anti-Indian border town. And so these trade forts, these fur forts, were the first man camps into our territories that later became border towns, the white-dominated settlements that ring Indian reservations, where rates of exploitation and violence against indigenous people define everyday life. And so when we're saying man camps, all we're saying is we're talking about the new rounds of accumulation of capital and the new incursions of capital into our territory. And who do they target first? They target our women, not because our women are quote unquote weak, or they target our two-spirit LGBTQ people because they understand indigenous women and our two-spirit and LGBTQ people represent an alternative political order. And so they have to be destroyed and they have to be erased, right? And so it's the targeting of these political orders that they go after first, right? And so I put this picture up here because if you haven't seen, there's a really amazing documentary called Warrior Women. These are the stars, the lovely Madonna Thunderhawk and her daughter, Marcy Gilbert, who helped shape the Red Power movement, right? And we often think of the Red Power movement with the Dennis Banks and the Russell Means of the world, but in reality, it was an indigenous. There were a lot of indigenous women who were the backbone of that movement, who continued on with the survival schools, continued on with the institution building, and the reason why they were the roots of that tree of life that Black Elk talked about. They kept alive those things through education and treaty schools. Phyllis Young is on the right or on the left of Madonna in the middle in the blue, and she was actually a Standing Rock councilwoman, but also an old Aimster gangster. And she was influential in the Standing Rock movement as well. And so this tradition, and of course, her daughter carries on that tradition of resistance. So in the 1970s, and there were over 30 survival schools that sprang up around the country to teach radical education to Native children who often had to go to public schools where they weren't taught Native history and culture. And so at Standing Rock, one of the first things that was created was in that same vein or in that same tradition, what they called the Defenders of the Water School, which was a self-organized school by the children of the camp, right? Because at its peak, there were about 10,000 people. It was like the 10th largest city in North Dakota, and so they had to, children have to go to school, and so this was created in response to that. And there were also homecomings, so to speak, of LGBTQ and Two-Spirit relatives. This is the Two-Spirit Grand Entry into camp, and it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It wasn't just something that was done in the sort of like how we understand sort of the Rainbow Coalition of modern social movements, but they were central to camp life and actually had a position on the council in the camp, but also they led direct actions. And this is a picture of them, of the Two-Spirit camp at a police line in a direct action, at a certain action that they had led. So in these next couple of pictures, this is just my first 2 days that I arrived in camp, and I have a bunch of other pictures, and I'm not going to go through the album of them. But this is a picture, a bird's eye view of the camp in late August. I helped build one of the cook shacks with a Palestinian relative that I met. His name is Imad. He lived in South Dakota. And I was like, hey, do you know the history of that T-shirt? And he was like, yeah, our people are we were fighting the same occupier. And so it was really interesting. And I'll get to a little bit about that connection in a bit. It wasn't just kind of like a one-off kind of thing. Of course, there's Dennis Banks, who passed away recently. These are the two people who are on my left and my right are people that helped organize the first International Indian Treaty Council with Phyllis Young, who was pictured earlier, at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in 1974. And that was an important gathering because the American Indian movement had kind of been chased out of all the reservation communities and was seen as antagonistic to a lot of tribal councils. And it was only Standing Rock that brought them in and said, hey, we want you to take our 68 treaty, or Treaty of Fort Laramie to the World Court, and we want you to prosecute the United States for genocide. And so began the 4 decades long struggle that ultimately led to the United Nations declarations of the rights of indigenous peoples, also known as UNDRIP, at the United Nations. So I want to turn now to the history of this river and why it's important, not just to the struggle or the story of No DAPL or the Dakota Access Pipeline, but why it's important to the struggle of the Ocheti Shakoni. My grandparents, Joyce and Andrew Estes, both Kuichasha from Lower Brule, fought the construction of the Pixlone dams in the 1950s and 1960s. The dams flooded nearly all of my great-grandmother Cornelia Sawala's allotment. My grandfather, a World War II veteran, and according to my father Ben, a Lakota code talker, returned from the war to find his homelands and nation under threat from the very government he fought to defend. Our lands and lives were targeted not because they held precious labor or precious resources or labor to be extracted. In fact, the opposite was true. Our lands and lives were targeted and held value because they could be wasted, submerged, destroyed. Grandpa Andrew, nicknamed Brown for his dark complexion, later gifted his mother Cornelia's remaining allotted lands to the Lower Brule Sioux tribe so that our nation could rebuild the inundated Lower Brule town site. In 1937, my great-grandfather Reuben Estes, Cornelia's husband and the first tribal chairman, opposed the state of South Dakota's attempt to build dams on the Missouri River without Lower Brule's consent. The old ones called Reuben Tongue, because after butchering his cattle, he gave away all the meat to the elders and the hungry, keeping only the tongues for himself. My ancestors were tribal historians, writers, intellectuals, and fierce indigenous nationalists at a time when Indians weren't supposed to be anything but drunk, stupid, or dead. They were also water protectors, treaty defenders, and humble people of the earth, and they fought for and took care of Minnesota as best as they could. In 1963, my grandfather, Frank Estes, who was named after Franklin Delano Roosevelt in honor of the Indian New Deal, wrote and published the first book on Lower Brule. It was a study of indigenous movement before and during the reservation period. As a response to the forced removals caused by the Fort Randall and Big Bend dams, and a challenge to the confinement narrative that Native people should just stay home in prisoner of war camps, now called reservations, out of sight and out of mind. In 1971, my grandfather, George Estes, with Richard Loder, co-wrote Kuichasha Oyate, a more extensive history of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, including the reconstruction of our communities and families after surviving forced removal by the U.S. military to our river reservation homeland in the 19th century, as well as 2 forced relocations caused by the Pixlone dams in the 20th century. My grandfather Andrew, who had only an 8th grade education, wrote in the preface to that book what would have been a fitting epigraph for this book about our nation's history and the defense of our land, our water, and our people. Quote, "My people's history has been lost or destroyed since the coming of the white man. My people in many ways have been lost and destroyed by the coming of the white man. This book is not the whole story of my people, nor is it all that is best in our heritage. Some of our traditions, our hopes, and our roots we will never write down for the world to see. What we will allow the world to see is in good part in these pages. Read them, my brothers, and you, white man, you read them too. It is a history of a proud people, a people who believe in the land and themselves. My people were civilized before the white man came, and we will be civilized and here after the white man goes away. Poisoned by his misuse of the land and eaten up by his own greed and disease," end quote. In September 2016, at a No DAPL protest in Chicago, organized by the Native community and groups such as Black Lives Matter, I told this family history in front of a crowd of thousands outside the Army Corps headquarters. My ancestors could never have imagined that thousands, perhaps millions, would one day rally to defend the river, our relative, Minnesota. Half a century ago, there were no mass protests against the dams that still wreak havoc on our river, a history that I have spent more than a decade speaking and writing about with little interest from the outside world. As we marched, a light rain fell. "Tell me what the prophecy looks like," we chanted. "This is what the prophecy looks like." And it was prophecy. Prophecy told of Zuzetcha Sapa, the black snake extending itself across the land and imperiling all life, beginning with the water. From its heads, or many heads, it would spew death and destruction. To protect Unchimaka, or Grandmother Earth, indigenous and non-indigenous peoples will have to unite to turn back the forces destroying the earth, capitalism and colonialism. So this is a picture of the old Lower Burrell town site, which is underwater. And this is a photograph of, in the top left is my Grandpa Brown, the tallest guy. We're a small nation, but we're big people. And this is the picture of the Lower Burrell town site before the flooding. And you'll notice in this next photograph, this is a picture after the flooding, that all of those trees on that island were all flooded out. And so we have in the middle of our river these dead trees that are sticking out of the ground because the Army Corps of Engineers would not allow us to cut down the trees to save the timber because they said we already paid you for those. And so as a result, 90% of our commercial timber was destroyed and 75% of our wildlife and our plant life was destroyed. That means like the deer, the elk, all those people or all those nations that we had entered into relations with when we made that first compact with Teiskanwi, or the white buffalo calf woman. And it introduced a cash economy. We went from subsistence to wage labor, right? And it was also worked in tandem with termination and relocation at the time. Another thing that's also forgotten is because we are, stereotyped as nomadic buffalo hunters, they don't think of us as agriculturalists, right? And I found a lot of picture evidence or photographic evidence of the immense agricultural production that a lot of our communities had just to sustain themselves by living in this like fertile river bottom. This is a picture of the floodwaters slowly creeping up. And then a picture of the Government Accountability Office, which is really funny. In Chicago, which is the headquarters of the Army Corps of Engineers. And that's me, shameless picture. And I want to conclude by reading some of the passages of the conclusion of this book by also offering some thoughts. As at Greasy Grass on June 25th, 1876, Lakotas, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes blew out the birthday candles a week before the United States celebrated its 100 years of liberty. The Plains Indigenous Alliance annihilated Custer and 268 of his men. Custer had launched the surprise attack on the large encampment to kill Indians and force them back onto reservations in a perfect expression of the settler state's death culture. The indigenous encampment was, in contrast to life culture, celebrating the annual renewal of life with a sundance, a humble ceremony in which dancers sacrificed their bodies by fasting without food and water for 4 days in order for their nation and the world to live. Indigenous peoples from reservations had slipped away to join their relatives at the camp and enjoy a brief taste of freedom. U.S. history books and popular culture typically depict the battle as Custer's last stand. The very earth seemed to grow Indians, Colonel Marcus Reno later reported, running towards me in swarms and from all directions. Put simply, they were surrounded. In their book, The Undercommons, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney draw from Michael Parenti's anti-imperialist study of Hollywood films, which always portray colonization as upside down. Invasion looks like self-defense, and the settlers hiding in their militarized forts are the real victims of an encircling native aggression. Such a reversal of roles in which aggressor becomes victim is a make-believe national narrative that began when settlers first invaded indigenous lands in North America and repeats itself every time the United States invades or bombs another country in its overseas imperial project. Yet, Moten and Harney argue it is simultaneously very true that the settler is, in a way, surrounded and outnumbered. While indigenous peoples have been rendered a statistical minority within our own homelands, the power of indigenous lifeways and resistance has always surrounded settlers in North America. Along with their tenuous claims to land ownership. And the perpetual threat of indigenous nations is that they are a reminder of the settlers' own precarious claims to land and belonging. Like the Army Corps of Engineers, and often working alongside them, the planners of the Dakota Access Pipeline imagined building a pipeline in a world where Native people did not exist. And in the original maps, they actually erased reservation boundaries. They had to imagine us out of existence to justify trespassing onto our territory and protected treaty lands. And when the pipeline risked interfering with white residential areas in Bismarck, North Dakota, it was rerouted so that the danger of water contamination was outsourced downriver to the Native nation of Standing Rock. In the emails from the private security, or the emails from the law enforcement agencies, officers shared a Federal Emergency Management Agency Field of Force Operations Manual, which guided police officers in correct crowd control methods, pain compliance techniques, and application of riot control agents, including chemical weapons and projectiles such as rubber bullets and beanbag rounds. These non-lethal weapons were deployed against unarmed protesters with ritualistic brutality, taking 2 individuals' eyesight and 1 woman's arm, while wounding and traumatizing countless others. And they made these connections with IDF, or Israeli Defense Force, training videos on the use and deployment of chemical weapons such as skunk spray. And in one email, they actually celebrated the use of skunk spray and advocated for its usage not only at Standing Rock, but also at the border, the US-Mexico border. And so in many ways, the connections were clear. Local law enforcement and private security imagined themselves participating in a global counterinsurgency against civilian populations that extended from Palestine to Baltimore, Ferguson, and the US-Mexico border, and now Standing Rock. The war against Black life, Palestinian life, migrant life, and Native life. And the tactics deployed by Tiger Swan, the murky mercenary security contractor hired by DAPL, were also a confirmation that this was a global war. The security company had cut its teeth in the United States' never-ending war on terror, in which it was deployed to run counterinsurgency operations against civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Tiger Swan now applied these same techniques to water protectors. The Intercept reports that security personnel frequently refer to water protectors as terrorists, planned prayer actions as attacks, and the camps as a battlefield. They also tracked the presence of water protectors of Middle Eastern descent, noting specifically the presence of Palestinians in the camps. Tiger Swan went so far as to describe the indigenous uprising as a jihadist insurgency. And when Tiger Swan briefed the local law enforcement on the camp activities, they frequently referenced aerial photography, which they used to monitor the growth and movement of camps. In one such situation report, an image was superimposed atop the camp. This was Harambe, the gorilla killed at the Cincinnati Zoo when a black child fell into his cage. On one hand, white supremacists have used the killing of Harambe to mock black people online, charging that the gorilla had to be killed because the black parents are careless. On the other hand, the comparison of black people to monkeys and gorillas is a well-established racist trope. Now Tiger Swan was evoking this anti-black history to racialize, mock, and degrade water protectors with tropes of primitivism. To DAPL and law enforcement, the camps were a place of death, a place to be destroyed, a place that threatened to expose the illegitimacy of settlement. In contrast, in the orientation pamphlet for new camp arrivals was a hand-drawn map of the site. Roads had been named for indigenous revolutionary heroes such as Red Cloud and the Red Warrior Societies. Indigenous nations had set up their own camps on site, and their locations also shown. The map indicated where to find camp security, who were tasked in part with keeping out drugs and alcohol. It also showed where to get food, medical care, and camp supplies. This reflected the values of the new community, that indigenous peoples not merely survive but thrive. No DAPL offered a brief vision of what a future premised on indigenous justice would look like. For all its faults, there is something to be learned from the treaty camps at the confluence of the Missouri and Cannibal rivers. Free food, free education, free health care, free legal aid, a strong sense of community and security were guaranteed to all. Most reservations in the United States don't have access to these services, nor do most poor people. Yet in the absence of empire, people came together to help each other, to care for one another. The no-DAPL camps were designed according to need, not profit. There were no prisons or armed bodies of the state. That's what separated the world of cops, settlers, and oil companies that surrounded them. Capitalism is not merely an economic system, but also a social system. And it was here abundantly evident that indigenous social systems offered a radically different way of relating to other people and the world. So drawing from the Black radical tradition, Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the creation of this kind of world a form of abolition geography that starts from the homely place that freedom is a place, or the homely premise that freedom is a place. Indeed, indigenous freedom was and is a place, and for a moment it took shape in the form of the no-DAPL camps. And they did not just imagine a future without settler colonialism and the oppressive institutions of the state, but created that future in the here and now. They were a resurgent geography that connected indigenous peoples with the land. Unlike the cynical and exclusive world of the settler who had removed, confined, erased, and dispossessed indigenous peoples from place, this place capaciously welcomed the excluded while also centering the core of an indigenous life world, relationality. As at its center was the resurgence and reunification of the Oceti Sakowin, and much like the first Palestinian Intifada, anti-colonial resistance began by delinking the community from the settler state. From 1987 to 1993, Palestinians built in alternative economies, popular education models, healthcare services, and women's communities. Palestinian women also used the revolution underway to challenge heteropatriarchy, which was an anathema to Palestinian liberation from Israeli occupation. And during the no-DAPL camps, women, LGBTQ, and Two-Spirit activists challenged settler colonialism and did so according to their own customs, calling on cis indigenous men to recognize that heteropatriarchy was just as untenable as the US occupation or as the destruction of land and water. And beyond the Dakota Access Pipeline, there are also growing fights, or continuing fights, I should say, against the Kinder Morgan Pipeline in so-called Canada, the Keystone XL Pipeline, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, Enbridge Line 9 in Minnesota, Bayou Bridge in Louisiana, and TransCanada Energy East. Each of these flashpoints demonstrates that we're resisting what could be ostensibly called the infrastructure of settler colonialism, right? And this is a map of the pipelines that are proposed or being built right now as of last year. And I like to show this one because this is our infrastructure of resistance. This is a map that the Morton County Sheriff's Department used to sort of defame and criminalize water protectors, to say, look, they're all a bunch of outside agitators. And when we saw this map when it was first published, they took it down, of course, but I reposted it on my Facebook because I was like, look at all the solidarity that we have. And I also want to say, because I'm running out of time and I want to have time for Q&A, but the current efforts by this administration to overthrow the democratically elected president of Venezuela are directly tied to the pipeline struggles. Back in 2007, during the Great Recession, there was also a simultaneous boom, an oil boom in North America. And Obama, under his all of the above energy plan, as well as a lot of people in the administrations of Canada under Harper and then Trudeau, have been fueling this boom in the creation of energy infrastructure, whether it's the Keystone XL pipeline. 3/4 of the Keystone XL pipeline had already been built under the approval of the Obama administration. Domestic oil production in the United States increased 70% during the Obama administration. Trump merely picked up where Obama left off, right? And when, in 2007, oil prices dropped, right? And it affected the economy for a little bit in Venezuela, which then stabilized again because its primary commodity is oil, right? Its primary export is oil. And both under Obama, up until 2016, when oil prices dropped because the US was well on its way at that time to becoming the primary or the largest oil producer in the world, it also began implementing sanctions against Venezuela, right? And the most recent sanctions by the Trump administration target every aspect of Venezuelan life that, everyday poor people need to access, just basic necessities, except for Chevron and Halliburton, right? It's very clear that we are fighting the same battle, right? And we have to remember that I was just back home and I was talking to a Lakota relative of mine who says, we love Hugo Chavez. Why do we love Hugo Chavez? Because Hugo Chavez filled our heating or our propane tanks up during the middle of a winter when the United States, decided that it wasn't going to subsidize oil in the northern plains, right? And where the price of oil, heating oils, is the highest. And so since 2007, CIT Group has been, which is a Venezuelan-owned, a state-owned oil company, has been subsidizing heating oil on reservations as well as in Black and Chicanx communities around this country. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about the reason why Venezuela economy is being squeezed is because the United States has been applying that pressure at the expense of indigenous lands. All the carbon infrastructure that is being built, whether it's the tar sands in Alberta, which will be transported through the Keystone XL pipeline, down to Houston, which there's miles and miles of oil refineries, is in an effort to make the United States, the oil king of the world, right? And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And many of the indigenous people that I know that connection, right? We remember that when the United States turned its back on us, or when it used our lands and lives to drill its way out of the Great Recession, that there were countries and peoples throughout the world that extended a helping hand. And so as we move into this next fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, I'm asking everyone in this room, if you want to get involved. This is me taking off my scholarly hat right now and being an organizer. If you are willing and able to help us in this next struggle, not just, we don't need you in South Dakota, but if and when it comes time that we need to mobilize people, we want you to sign what is called the Promise to Protect our homelands. But with that comes an obligation to learn about your own issues here in New York City, or in the state of New York, or in New England in general, your own indigenous issues here, and how you can best be a water protector here in your own place, and to get the training to how to come correct to our homelands, and how to be correct on the homelands of the Lenape people. So with that, I'll take some questions if you have any.